The wagon wheel spun lazily in the dirt, its iron rim catching the last rays of sunlight that filtered through the mountain pines. Elizabeth Moore knelt beside it, her calloused hands tracing the worn wood spokes, each groove telling a story of countless miles traveled across unforgiving terrain. The wheel had cost her everything she had left in this world, yet it felt like nothing compared to what she had already lost. "That's all she's worth," the blacksmith had said, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a man who had never known true desperation. "One wagon wheel for one widow. Fair trade, I'd say." Elizabeth's fingers tightened around the rough wood. The mountain settlement of Pine Ridge had rules, unspoken but absolute. A woman alone was a burden, a mouth to feed without hands strong enough to earn her keep. When her husband Joshua had died in the mine collapse 3 months ago, she had become nothing more than a problem to be solved, a commodity to be traded. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up. Alexander Ross emerged from the tree line, his massive frame silhouetted against the dying light. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent years navigating the wilderness alone, every step deliberate and sure. His weathered face bore the marks of countless seasons spent battling the elements, and his dark eyes held depths that spoke of experiences most men would never survive. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and respectful. He stopped a careful distance away, as if sensing her fragile state. "I heard about the arrangement." Elizabeth rose slowly, her worn dress rustling in the evening breeze. She had heard the stories about Alexander Ross, the mountain man who lived in the high country, trading furs and keeping to himself. Some said he was dangerous, others claimed he was touched by madness from too many winters spent alone. But standing before him now, she saw only a man who looked at her with something she had almost forgotten existed. Genuine concern. "It's done," she said quietly. "I leave with the Hendersons in the morning. They need someone to tend their children on the journey west." Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And what did they pay for you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Elizabeth gestured toward the wagon wheel, unable to meet his eyes. "Enough to fix their broken axle. They said it was more than fair. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments." The silence that followed stretched between them like a chasm. Alexander Ross had seen many injustices in his years on the frontier, but this casual reduction of a human being to the value of a piece of wood stirred something deep within his chest, something he had thought buried long ago. "No," he said finally, the single word carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Elizabeth looked up, startled by the quiet intensity in his voice. "I don't understand. You're not going with them." Alexander turned and walked toward the settlement's main street, his long strides eating up the ground. "Wait here." She watched him disappear into the gathering dusk, her heart hammering against her ribs. What could he possibly mean? The arrangement was made, the deal struck. She had no say in the matter, no power to change what had been decided for her. The story of how Elizabeth Moore had come to this moment began 6 months earlier, when the first snows of winter had blanketed the mountain settlement of Pine Ridge. She had been a different woman then, married to Joshua Hughes, a hard-working miner with gentle hands and dreams of striking it rich in the silver veins that threaded through the mountain like frozen lightning. Their cabin had been small but warm, filled with the quiet contentment of two people who had found in each other a refuge from the harsh realities of frontier life. Joshua would return each evening, covered in rock dust and exhaustion, but his eyes would light up when he saw Elizabeth waiting for him, a simple meal prepared and the fire burning bright against the mountain cold. "Someday," he would tell her as they sat together in the flickering firelight, "we'll have enough to buy our own land. Maybe down in the valley where the soil is rich and the winters aren't so cruel." Elizabeth would nod and smile, though she had long ago stopped believing in some days. She had learned to find joy in the present moment, in the warmth of Joshua's hand in hers, in the sound of his breathing beside her as they slept. The future was a luxury she could not afford to contemplate too deeply. The mine collapse had happened on a Tuesday morning in late February. Elizabeth had been hanging laundry on the line behind their cabin when she heard the rumble, deep and ominous, rolling down from the mountainside like thunder. She had dropped the wet sheet she was holding and run toward the mine entrance. her heart already knowing what her mind refused to accept. 17 men had been working the morning shift. Only 9 had made it out alive. Joshua had been found 3 days later, buried under tons of rock and timber, his body broken but his face peaceful, as if he had simply laid down to rest. Elizabeth had knelt beside him in the makeshift morgue, her tears freezing on her cheeks in the bitter mountain air, and felt something inside her break as surely as the mine shaft had broken. The weeks that followed had passed in a blur of condolences and casseroles, of well-meaning neighbors who spoke in hushed tones about God's plan and better places. Elizabeth had nodded and thanked them. But inside she felt as empty as the abandoned mine shaft, as cold as the February wind that howled through the pines. It was not until the last of the funeral food had been eaten and the final sympathy visit had ended that the real cruelty began. Without Joshua's income from the mine, Elizabeth had no means of supporting herself. The small savings they had accumulated disappeared quickly, consumed by the basic necessities of survival. The cabin they had rented became impossible to afford, and the landlord, Brian Watson, made it clear that charity had its limits. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hughes," he had said, standing in her doorway, his hat in his hands and his eyes focused somewhere over her shoulder, "but I've got my own family to think about. I can give you until the end of the month." Elizabeth had found work where she could, taking in washing, mending clothes, helping with difficult births, when the settlement's single doctor was unavailable. But the mountain community was small and poor, and there was little money to spare for services that wives and daughters could provide for free. As spring arrived and the snow began to melt, Elizabeth realized with growing desperation that she was fighting a losing battle. She had sold everything of value, from Joshua's mining tools to her own wedding ring, but it was never enough. The settlement's unspoken hierarchy had shifted around her, and she found herself occupying a space reserved for those who had become burdens rather than contributors. It was Mary Clark, the blacksmith's wife, who had first suggested the arrangement with the Hendersons. The family was preparing to join a wagon train heading west to California, but their regular hired girl had taken sick and could not make the journey. They needed someone to help with their 3 young children, someone to cook and clean and tend to the countless small tasks that made such a journey possible. "It would be perfect for you, Elizabeth," Mary had said, her voice bright with the enthusiasm of someone solving a problem that was not her own. "A fresh start, away from all the sad memories. And the Hendersons are good Christian people. They'll treat you fairly." The negotiations had been handled by the men, as such things always were. Elizabeth had sat in Mary Clark's kitchen, sipping weak tea and listening as the terms of her future were decided without her input. She would travel with the Henderson family as their hired help, receiving room and board, but no wages. In exchange, the Hendersons would pay for her passage by providing a replacement wagon wheel for the blacksmith, who had agreed to take on Elizabeth's remaining debts. "One wagon wheel," Elizabeth had repeated numbly, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. "It's quite generous, really," Mary had assured her. "Wagon wheels are expensive, especially ones made to last, and you'll be earning your keep with honest work. It's better than charity." Elizabeth had wanted to argue, to demand better terms, to insist on her own worth as something more than a piece of equipment. But the alternative was starvation or worse, and she had seen what happened to women who had no protection and no means of support. The frontier was not kind to the vulnerable, and she had already learned that survival sometimes required swallowing one's pride along with one's tears. Now, as she stood beside that wagon wheel in the fading light, Elizabeth wondered if she had made the right choice. The Hendersons seemed decent enough, though she had detected a coldness in Mrs. Henderson's eyes when they had met to discuss the arrangement. The woman had looked at Elizabeth the way one might examine a horse before purchase, evaluating her strength and durability with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to getting value for her money. The sound of voices carried across the settlement's main street, pulling Elizabeth from her brooding thoughts. She could see Alexander Ross standing outside the blacksmith's shop, his tall frame rigid with controlled anger. Even from a distance, she could sense the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. "You can't be serious," came Brian Watson's voice, loud enough to carry in the still evening air. "She's already been paid for." Then I'll buy her back, Alexander replied, his tone deadly quiet. Elizabeth felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger. Buy her back as if she were livestock to be traded at will. She started toward the group of men, her worn boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each determined step. I'm not a piece of property, she said, her voice cutting through the conversation like a blade. The men turned to look at her, surprise evident on their faces. Women did not typically interrupt such discussions, especially not women in Elizabeth's precarious position. Alexander's dark eyes met hers, and she saw something there that made her breath catch. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. No, ma'am, you're not, he said simply, which is why this whole arrangement is wrong. The blacksmith, Aaron Thomas, shifted uncomfortably. He was a decent man at heart, but like many in the settlement, he had become accustomed to thinking of problems in terms of practical solutions rather than moral implications. Now see here, Ross, the deal's been made fair and square. The Hendersons need help, and Mrs. Hughes needs a situation. Everyone benefits. Everyone except her, Alexander said, gesturing toward Elizabeth. When did we decide that a human being could be traded for wagon parts? She agreed to it, Brian Watson interjected. No one forced her into anything. Alexander's laugh was harsh and bitter. What choice did you give her, starve or sell herself for the price of a wheel? That's not a choice. That's coercion. Elizabeth found herself caught between gratitude and humiliation. She appreciated Alexander's defense of her dignity, but his intervention also highlighted just how powerless she had become. I can speak for myself, she said quietly. Then speak, Alexander said, turning to face her fully. Tell them what you really want. The question hung in the air like a challenge. What did she want? For months, Elizabeth had focused solely on survival, on finding any solution that would keep her fed and sheltered. She had not allowed herself to consider wants, only needs. But now, faced with Alexander's direct gaze and the attention of the gathered men, she found herself reaching for something deeper. I want to be valued for more than my desperation, she said finally. I want to work for wages, not just room and board. I want to have some say in my own future. Aaron Thomas shook his head. That's not how things work here, Mrs. Hughes. You know that. We all have to make do with what we can get. Maybe it's time things work differently, Alexander said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch, heavy with coins. I'll buy your wagon wheel, Thomas, and I'll pay Mrs. Hughes fair wages to keep house for me through the summer. Come fall, if she wants to leave, she'll have money in her pocket and choices to make. The offer sent a ripple of shock through the small group. Elizabeth stared at Alexander, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. You don't even know me, she said. I know enough, he replied. I know you've been treated poorly by people who should have done better, and I know you deserve a chance to rebuild your life on your own terms. Brian Watson stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. You can't just come down from your mountain and disrupt arrangements that have already been made. The Hendersons are counting on her. Then they can find someone else, Alexander said calmly. Someone who chooses to work for them, not someone who's been sold to them. The confrontation might have escalated further, but the arrival of Carol Mitchell, the settlement's unofficial leader and the preacher's wife, brought a different energy to the discussion. Carol was a woman of strong opinions and stronger will, someone who had earned respect through years of organizing charity drives, settling disputes, and generally keeping the peace in a community where tempers could run as hot as the forge fires. What's all this commotion about? She asked, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with practiced efficiency. When the situation was explained to her, she listened with the patient attention of someone accustomed to mediating conflicts. It seems to me, Carol said when the explanations had finished, that we've forgotten something important in all this discussion of wheels and wages and arrangements. She turned to Elizabeth, her expression softening. What do you want to do, dear? Not what's been decided for you, not what's practical or convenient for others, but what you truly want. Elizabeth felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. When was the last time someone had asked her that question? When was the last time her own desires had been considered relevant to decisions about her life? I want to stay, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. This is where Joshua is buried. This is where we were happy. Even if it was only for a little while, I don't want to leave him behind. The admission seemed to settle something in the group. Even Brian Watson's expression softened slightly, though his practical concerns remained evident. But you can't stay without means of support, Aaron Thomas pointed out. That's the whole problem we're trying to solve. Which is why my offer stands, Alexander said. He looked directly at Elizabeth, his dark eyes serious and intent. I live alone up in the high country, and I could use help with cooking, cleaning, preserving food for winter. It's honest work, and I'll pay honest wages. You'd have your own space, your own privacy. And come spring, if you want to move on, you'll have money saved and references that will help you find a better situation. Elizabeth studied his face, searching for hidden motives or ulterior purposes. She had heard the stories about Alexander Ross, about his solitary life in the mountains and his reputation for avoiding human contact. Why would such a man suddenly offer to help a desperate widow? Why? She asked simply. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as if he were looking at something only he could see. Because I know what it's like to be alone, he said finally. And I know what it's like to have people make assumptions about who you are based on circumstances beyond your control. There was pain in his voice, old and carefully contained, but unmistakably real. Elizabeth recognized it because she carried the same kind of pain herself, the weight of losses that could never be fully explained or understood by those who had not experienced them. Carol Mitchell nodded approvingly. It sounds like a reasonable arrangement to me. Elizabeth, you'd be working for wages, maintaining your independence, and staying near your husband's grave. Mr. Ross, you'd have help with the practical matters of mountain living. It seems like both parties would benefit. But what about the Hendersons? Brian Watson protested. They've already paid for her passage. They paid for a wagon wheel, Alexander corrected, which they'll still receive. The fact that they assumed they were buying a person along with it is their mistake, not ours. Aaron Thomas looked uncomfortable but nodded slowly. I suppose that's true. The wheel was the agreed-upon payment. What Mrs. Hughes does with her life after that is her own business. Elizabeth felt a strange sensation in her chest, as if something that had been tightly wound was finally beginning to loosen. For the first time in months, she was being offered a choice that was truly her own to make, with terms that recognized her worth as more than just a burden to be shifted from one household to another. I accept, she said, looking directly at Alexander. I'll work for you through the summer if the offer is genuine. It's genuine, he replied, and something in his tone made her believe him completely. The practical details were settled quickly after that. Alexander paid Aaron Thomas for the wagon wheel, ensuring that the Hendersons would still receive what they had bargained for. Brian Watson grumbled about disrupted arrangements, but accepted that the debt Elizabeth owed him would be paid in full. Carol Mitchell offered to help Elizabeth gather her few belongings and prepare for the move to Alexander's mountain cabin. As the group dispersed and the evening settled into full darkness, Elizabeth found herself alone with Alexander beside the wagon wheel that had started it all. The irony was not lost on her that this simple piece of wood and iron, intended to carry the Hendersons away from Pine Ridge, had instead become the catalyst for her own journey towards something resembling freedom. When do we leave? She asked. Tomorrow, if you were ready, waiting, Alexander replied. The cabin is about a day's ride up into the high country. It's isolated and the work is hard, but it's peaceful. You'll have time to grieve properly without people watching and judging and offering unwanted advice. Elizabeth nodded, understanding more than he had said aloud. She had felt the weight of constant scrutiny since Joshua's death, the way neighbors watch for signs of weakness or impropriety, ready to offer criticism disguised as concern. The idea of space and solitude, of being able to mourn and heal without an audience, was almost too precious to believe. Thank you, she said simply. Alexander touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. Don't thank me yet. Wait until you've seen what you're getting yourself into. But as Elizabeth watched him walk away into the darkness, she felt something she had not experienced since the mine collapse. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone clinging to the edge of a cliff, but the quiet, steady hope of someone who had been offered a hand up instead of a push down. The journey to Alexander's cabin began before dawn, when the mountain air was sharp enough to cut, and the stars were still visible in the lightning sky. Elizabeth had spent the night at Carol Mitchell's house, her few possessions packed into a single worn carpet bag that contained everything she owned in the world. It was a sobering reminder of how much she had lost, but also strangely liberating. There was something to be said for traveling light, for having few enough belongings that they could be carried without effort. Alexander arrived precisely when he had promised, leading a sturdy mountain horse loaded with supplies. He helped Elizabeth mount a gentle mare he had brought for her use, his hands respectful and careful as he adjusted the stirrups to accommodate her shorter legs. "She's called Sage," he said, patting the mare's neck. "She's sure-footed and calm, good for mountain trails. She'll take care of you." As they rode out of Pine Ridge, Elizabeth turned for one last look at the settlement that had been her home for the past 2 years. The small collection of buildings looked peaceful in the early morning light, smoke rising from chimneys as families prepared for another day of frontier life. She could see the cemetery on the hill above town, where Joshua lay beneath a simple wooden cross she had carved herself. "We can visit whenever you want," Alexander said quietly, noticing the direction of her gaze. "It's not so far that we can't make the trip when you feel the need." Elizabeth nodded, grateful for his understanding. She had worried that accepting his offer would mean abandoning Joshua's memory, but Alexander seemed to recognize that grief was not something to be left behind like an old coat. It was something to be carried and integrated, acknowledged and honored rather than forgotten. The trail Alexander chose led steadily upward, winding through dense forests of pine and aspen that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and cleaner, carrying scents of wildflowers and mountain streams that Elizabeth had almost forgotten existed. The settlement of Pine Ridge, with its constant smell of wood smoke and unwashed bodies, seemed like another world entirely. "How long have you lived up here?" Elizabeth asked as they paused to rest the horses beside a crystal-clear creek. "7 years," Alexander replied, loosening his horse's girth to let the animal breathe more easily. "I came here after—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "After I decided I needed to be alone for a while." Elizabeth sensed there was more to the story, but she did not press. She understood the need for solitude, the desire to escape from well-meaning people who thought they knew what was best for you. Perhaps that was why Alexander had been so quick to recognize her situation and offer an alternative. They continued climbing as the sun reached its zenith, the trail growing narrower and more challenging as they ascended. Elizabeth found herself impressed by Alexander's horsemanship and his obvious familiarity with the terrain. He moved through the wilderness with the confidence of someone who had made it his home, reading signs in the landscape that were invisible to her untrained eyes. "There," he said finally, pointing ahead to where the trail crested a ridge. "Home." Elizabeth followed his gaze and felt her breath catch. The cabin sat in a natural clearing, surrounded by towering pines, its log walls weathered to a warm golden brown that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. It was larger than she had expected, with a wide front porch and what appeared to be several rooms. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, and she could see a well-tended garden plot beside the house. "It's beautiful," she said and meant it. "It's functional," Alexander replied, but she could hear the pride in his voice. "I built most of it myself, added onto it over the years as I found materials and had time. There's a separate room that will be yours with its own entrance if you prefer privacy." As they approached the cabin, Elizabeth could see the care that had gone into its construction. The logs were perfectly fitted, the chinking solid and weather-tight. The porch was swept clean and adorned with simple furniture that looked handcrafted but sturdy. Everything spoke of a man who took pride in his work and his surroundings, even in solitude. Alexander helped her down from Sage and led both horses to a small barn that sat behind the cabin. The building was as well maintained as the house, with clean stalls and plenty of hay stored in the loft above. Elizabeth found herself revising her assumptions about mountain men and their living conditions. Whatever Alexander's reasons for choosing isolation, it was clearly not due to an inability to care for himself or his property. "Let me show you around," he said, shouldering her carpet bag as if it weighed nothing. "Then you can decide if you want to stay or if I should take you back to town." The interior of the cabin was even more impressive than the exterior. The main room was spacious and comfortable, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall and windows that looked out over the mountain vista. The furniture was simple but well made, clearly crafted by someone with both skill and patience. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that suggested a man of broader education than his rustic lifestyle might indicate. "You read," Elizabeth observed, running her fingers along the spine of a well-worn copy of Shakespeare. "Long winters," Alexander replied with a slight smile. "A man needs something to occupy his mind when the snow is too deep to venture outside." He led her through the cabin, showing her the kitchen with its efficient layout and well-stocked pantry, the small room that served as his workshop where he crafted furniture and repaired tools, and finally the room that would be hers. It was clean and simply furnished, with a comfortable bed, a writing desk, and its own small fireplace. Most importantly, it had its own door that opened onto the side porch, providing the privacy he had promised. "The work isn't complicated," Alexander explained as they returned to the main room. "Cooking, cleaning, laundry, preserving food for winter. I hunt and fish, tend the garden, maintain the buildings and equipment. We'd be partners in keeping the place running, each contributing what we do best." Elizabeth nodded, already beginning to see how such an arrangement might work. "What about wages?" $50 for the summer, plus room and board," Alexander said without hesitation. "Payable at the end of the season, or in installments if you prefer. And if you decide to stay longer, we can renegotiate terms." $50 was more than Elizabeth had expected, more than she could have earned in town, even if steady work had been available. It was enough to give her real choices come autumn, enough to start over somewhere else if she chose, or to negotiate from a position of strength if she decided to remain in the area. "It's generous," she said carefully. "It's fair," Alexander corrected. "I've been living like a bachelor for 7 years, eating poorly and letting things slide because I had no one to help and no incentive to do better. You'll earn every penny. I promise you that." Elizabeth spent the rest of that first day exploring her new surroundings and beginning to understand the rhythm of life in the high country. Alexander was right about the work being hard, but it was honest labor with visible results, unlike the desperate scrambling for survival she had known in Pine Ridge. Here, each task had a purpose and a place in the larger pattern of mountain living. The garden needed weeding and watering, work that reminded Elizabeth of happier times when she and Joshua had tended their small plot behind their cabin. The kitchen required a thorough cleaning and reorganization, projects that allowed her to put her own stamp on the space while respecting Alexander's established routines. Most importantly, there was enough work to keep her hands busy and her mind occupied, leaving less time for the dark thoughts that had plagued her since Joshua's death. Alexander proved to be a considerate employer and housemate. He gave her space to settle in without hovering or offering unwanted advice, but remained available when she had questions about where things belonged or how he preferred certain tasks to be done. He was quiet by nature, she realized, but it was the comfortable quiet of someone at peace with himself rather than the sullen silence of a man nursing grievances. That first evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset behind the mountain peaks, Elizabeth found herself beginning to relax for the first time in months. The air was clean and cool, filled with the sounds of evening birds and the distant murmur of the creek that ran behind the cabin. It was so different from the cramped, noisy atmosphere of the settlement that she felt as if she had stepped into another world entirely. "Why did you really help me?" she asked suddenly, the question emerging before she could second-guess herself. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the changing colors of the sky. "I had a wife once," he said finally. "Sarah. She died in childbirth along with our son. It was difficult." Elizabeth felt her heart constrict with sympathy. She had wondered about his past, about what had driven him to seek solitude in the mountains, but she had not expected such a direct answer to her question. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "It was a long time ago," Alexander replied, though the pain in his voice suggested otherwise. "But I remember what it felt like to have people make decisions for me, to have them assume they knew what was best without asking what I wanted. After Sarah died, everyone had opinions about what I should do, where I should go, how I should grieve. They meant well, but But they didn't understand, Elizabeth finished. No, they didn't. So I came here, where I could grieve in my own way and in my own time, and I've been here ever since. The admission created a new understanding between them, a recognition of shared experience that went deeper than employer and employee. They were both refugees from a world that had proven too harsh and judgmental, both seeking space to heal from losses that others could not comprehend. Do you ever regret it? Elizabeth asked. The isolation, I mean. Alexander considered the question seriously. Sometimes, there are aspects of community life that I miss, the sense of shared purpose and mutual support. But I found peace here, and that's worth a great deal. As the days passed, Elizabeth began to understand what he meant. There was something profoundly restorative about the mountain environment and about waking each morning to clean air and endless vistas instead of the cramped confines of settlement life. The work was demanding but satisfying, and she found herself taking pride in the improvements she was able to make to their shared living space. Alexander, for his part, seemed to be rediscovering aspects of domestic life that he had forgotten during his years of solitude. He began taking more care with his appearance, shaving regularly and wearing clean clothes. He started preparing more elaborate meals when Elizabeth expressed interest in learning his techniques for preserving meat and vegetables. Most tellingly, he began talking more, sharing stories of his adventures in the wilderness and his observations about the changing seasons. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Elizabeth found herself laughing at his dry humor, looking forward to their evening conversations on the porch, taking pleasure in the small domestic rituals that marked their shared days. It was not romance exactly, but something deeper and more sustainable, companionship built on mutual respect and understanding. One morning in late June, as Elizabeth was hanging laundry on the line Alexander had strung between two pine trees, she realized that she had not thought about her desperate circumstances in Pine Ridge for several days. The constant anxiety that had been her companion since Joshua's death had gradually faded, replaced by a sense of security and purpose that she had feared she might never experience again. You look different, Alexander observed when she came inside to start preparing their midday meal. Different how? Elizabeth asked, though she suspected she knew what he meant. Stronger, more like yourself, I imagine, instead of like someone trying to survive. Elizabeth paused in her work, considering his words. He was right, she realized. For months, she had been operating in a state of constant crisis, focused entirely on getting through each day without thought for anything beyond basic survival. Here in the mountains, with honest work and fair treatment, she was rediscovering parts of herself that had been buried under layers of grief and desperation. I feel more like myself, she admitted, more like the person I was before everything went wrong. Good, Alexander said simply. That's how it should be. But even as Elizabeth was finding her footing in this new life, forces beyond their mountain sanctuary were beginning to stir. In Pine Ridge, the Hendersons had not taken kindly to the disruption of their carefully laid plans. Mrs. Henderson in particular had been vocal in her displeasure at losing her hired help, and she had found willing listeners among the settlement's more conservative residents who disapproved of Alexander's interference in what they saw as a properly concluded business arrangement. The trouble began with rumors, as trouble often did in small communities, where gossip traveled faster than news, and speculation carried more weight than facts. Mrs. Henderson, still smarting from the loss of her hired help, had begun spreading whispers about the impropriety of a widow living alone with an unmarried man, regardless of the working arrangement between them. It's not natural, she confided to anyone willing to listen. A woman of her age living up there with that hermit. What kind of work could she possibly be doing that requires such isolation? The implications were clear, and they found fertile ground among those who had never approved of Alexander's solitary lifestyle or his intervention in what they considered settled business. Brian Watson, still resentful about the disruption to his carefully planned solution to Elizabeth's situation, added his voice to the chorus of disapproval. I always said there was something strange about that Ross fellow, he declared at the settlement's general store, where such pronouncements carry particular weight. Living alone up there for years, avoiding decent company, and now he swoops down like some kind of savior, disrupting arrangements that were made in good faith. Makes a man wonder what his real motives might be. The whispers might have remained just that, idle speculation with no real consequences, if not for the arrival of Jose Richardson, a territorial marshal who had come to Pine Ridge investigating reports of claimed jumping in the surrounding mining areas. Richardson was a man who took his responsibilities seriously, perhaps too seriously, and he had little patience for what he saw as the moral laxity of frontier communities. When the rumors about Elizabeth and Alexander reached his ears, Richardson saw an opportunity to impose some order on what he considered a lawless situation. In his view, unmarried men and women living together without proper supervision was a sign of moral decay that needed to be addressed before it spread. This kind of arrangement undermines the very foundation of civilized society, he declared to a gathering of settlement leaders. If we allow such behavior to continue unchallenged, what message does that send to our young people? What kind of community are we building here? Carol Mitchell, who had supported Elizabeth's choice from the beginning, tried to argue for reason and common sense. They have a working arrangement, nothing more. Mrs. Hughes is earning honest wages doing honest work. I see nothing improper in that. But Richardson was not interested in nuanced arguments. He had made up his mind that the situation required official intervention, and he had the authority to act on his convictions. The law is clear on such matters, he said. Cohabitation outside of marriage is a misdemeanor offense, punishable by fine and imprisonment. I intend to enforce that law. The news of Richardson's intentions reached Alexander and Elizabeth through Aaron Thomas, who rode up to the mountain cabin on a sweltering July morning with worry written across his weathered face. He found them working together in the garden, Elizabeth harvesting vegetables, while Alexander repaired a section of fence that had been damaged by a recent storm. You need to know what's happening in town, Aaron said without preamble. There's a marshal asking questions about your living arrangement, and he's got some people stirred up about propriety and such. Alexander straightened slowly, his expression darkening. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest he thinks something improper is going on up here, Aaron replied. Mrs. Henderson and some others have been filling his ears with speculation about a widow and a bachelor living together without proper supervision. Elizabeth felt her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. Just when she had begun to feel secure and hopeful, the judgmental voices of the settlement were reaching out to drag her back into their web of gossip and moral scrutiny. What does he want? She asked. He wants to put a stop to what he calls an immoral arrangement, Aaron said grimly. He's talking about charges, fines, maybe even jail time if you don't conform to what he considers proper behavior. Alexander's jaw tightened, and Elizabeth could see the anger building behind his controlled exterior. And what would he consider proper behavior? Marriage or separation, Aaron replied bluntly. Those are the only options he's willing to consider. The ultimatum hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Elizabeth felt the walls of her carefully reconstructed life beginning to crumble once again, the freedom and security she had found slipping away like water through her fingers. When? Alexander asked quietly. He's planning to ride up here tomorrow, Aaron said. He wants to see the situation for himself and deliver his demands in person. After Aaron left, Elizabeth and Alexander sat in silence on the cabin's porch, both lost in their own thoughts about this new threat to their peaceful arrangement. The irony was bitter. Just as Elizabeth was beginning to heal from the trauma of being treated as a commodity, she was once again being reduced to the subject of other people's moral judgments and legal interventions. I could leave, Elizabeth said finally. Go back to town, find some other arrangement. I won't have you facing legal troubles because you tried to help me? Alexander shook his head firmly. No, you've done nothing wrong and neither have I. We're not going to let some self-righteous marshal destroy what we've built here based on the gossip of bitter people. But if he has the law on his side, then we'll find another way, Alexander said with quiet determination. There has to be a solution that doesn't involve surrendering to prejudice and small-mindedness. That evening, as they sat by the fire discussing their options, Elizabeth found herself studying Alexander's profile in the flickering light. He had risked his own peace and security to offer her a chance at rebuilding her life, and now he was facing official persecution because of that kindness. The guilt she felt was almost overwhelming, but it was mixed with something else. a deep appreciation for the kind of man who would stand by his principles even when it cost him dearly. "Why are you willing to fight this?" she asked. "It would be easier to just let me go, to avoid the confrontation entirely." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as if they might hold the answer to her question. "Because what we have here is good," he said finally. "It's honest and decent and beneficial to both of us. I'm tired of letting other people's narrow thinking dictate how I live my life. And if we lose, if he forces us to separate anyway, then at least we'll have tried to do the right thing," Alexander replied. "Sometimes that's all you can do." Marshal Jose Richardson arrived at the cabin the next afternoon, riding a government horse and wearing his authority like armor. He was a lean man with cold eyes and a mouth that seemed permanently set in disapproval, the kind of official who found satisfaction in imposing order on situations he deemed chaotic or improper. Elizabeth watched him approach from the cabin's front window, her heart hammering with the familiar anxiety of someone who had learned to fear the judgment of those in power. Alexander stood beside her, his presence solid and reassuring, but she could sense the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. "Let me do the talking," Alexander said quietly, "at least at first." They met Richardson on the porch, presenting a united front that seemed to irritate the marshal before the conversation even began. He dismounted with deliberate ceremony, tying his horse to the porch rail as if claiming territory. "Mr. Ross," Richardson said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was more formality than courtesy. "Mrs. Hughes, I believe you know why I'm here." "I know you've been listening to gossip and drawing conclusions without facts," Alexander replied evenly. "Beyond that, I'm not sure what brings a territorial marshal to my private property." Richardson's eyes narrowed. "Your private property where you're harboring a woman in violation of territorial statutes regarding cohabitation and moral conduct. That makes it my business, Mr. Ross." "Mrs. Hughes is my employee," Alexander said. "She performs household duties in exchange for wages and accommodation. There's nothing illegal or immoral about that arrangement. An unmarried man and woman living together without proper supervision," Richardson countered. "The law is quite clear on such matters, regardless of whatever justification you might offer." Elizabeth stepped forward, her earlier fear giving way to anger at the marshal's dismissive tone. "I'm not a child who requires supervision," she said firmly. "I'm a widow trying to earn an honest living, and Mr. Ross has provided me with that opportunity when no one else would." Richardson looked at her with the kind of condescending patience that made Elizabeth's blood boil. "Mrs. Hughes, I understand that your circumstances have been difficult, but that doesn't excuse improper behavior. There are standards of decency that must be maintained, especially in frontier communities where moral guidance is often lacking." "Whose standards?" Alexander asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Yours? The people in town who were willing to trade her for a wagon wheel? What moral authority do they have to judge anyone?" "The law's authority," Richardson replied coldly, "which I am sworn to uphold regardless of personal opinion or local sentiment." The confrontation might have escalated into something uglier, but Elizabeth found herself remembering something Carol Mitchell had mentioned weeks earlier, a conversation about territorial law and the rights of property owners. An idea began to form in her mind, desperate but potentially effective. "What if we were married?" she asked suddenly, the words emerging before she could fully consider their implications. Both men turned to stare at her, Alexander with surprise and Richardson with suspicion. "I beg your pardon," the marshal said. "You said the law requires marriage or separation," Elizabeth continued, her mind racing as she developed the thought. "What if we chose marriage? Would that satisfy your concerns about propriety?" Richardson frowned, clearly caught off guard by the suggestion. "Well, yes, I suppose marriage would resolve the legal issues, but—" "Then that's what we'll do," Elizabeth said, looking directly at Alexander. "If you're willing." Alexander studied her face intently, as if trying to read her true thoughts behind the bold proposal. "Elizabeth, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she interrupted, "but I want to. This arrangement has been good for both of us, and if marriage is what it takes to protect it, then I'm willing to take that step." The silence that followed stretched like a held breath. Richardson looked from one to the other, clearly frustrated by this unexpected development. Alexander continued to study Elizabeth's face, searching for signs of desperation or coercion. "You're certain?" he asked quietly. "I'm certain," Elizabeth replied, and realized as she said it that it was true. The idea of marriage to Alexander didn't frighten her as it might have with another man. They had already established a partnership based on mutual respect and understanding. Making it legal would simply formalize what already existed between them. Alexander nodded slowly. "Then yes, I'm willing." Richardson sputtered with indignation. "You can't just decide to get married to avoid legal consequences. Marriage is a sacred institution, not a convenient legal loophole." "Marriage is a contract between two consenting adults," Alexander corrected. "And we're both consenting adults who have found value in our partnership. If the law requires marriage to legitimize our arrangement, then we'll comply with the law." "But this is clearly a marriage of convenience," Richardson protested. "So are many marriages on the frontier," Elizabeth said calmly. "People marry for practical reasons all the time. Companionship, economic security, mutual support, those are all present in our situation." Richardson found himself trapped by his own rigid interpretation of the law. He had demanded marriage or separation, and they had chosen the marriage. By his own standards, he could hardly object to their decision to comply with his requirements. "Very well," he said stiffly, "but I'll expect proof that this marriage has taken place within a reasonable time frame, and I'll be watching to ensure that it's a genuine union, not just a legal fiction designed to circumvent proper authority." After Richardson left, muttering about the moral decline of frontier society, Elizabeth and Alexander found themselves alone with the magnitude of what they had just committed to. The proposal had emerged from desperation and defiance, but now they had to face the reality of what marriage would mean for both of them. "Do you regret it already?" Alexander asked, settling beside her on the porch steps. Elizabeth considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "I don't regret it. Do you?" "No," Alexander replied, "but I want you to understand that this doesn't have to change anything between us if you don't want it to. We can make it a legal arrangement only, nothing more." Elizabeth nodded, grateful for his consideration, but also aware of a subtle shift in her own feelings. The idea of being married to Alexander, of making their partnership permanent and official, held an appeal that went beyond mere legal necessity. "We'll figure it out as we go," she said, "just like we figured out everything else." The wedding took place 3 weeks later in Pine Ridge's small church, with Carol Mitchell serving as witness and Aaron Thomas giving Elizabeth away in the absence of family. It was a simple ceremony lacking the elaborate trappings that might have marked a more conventional union, but it carried a weight and significance that surprised both participants. Elizabeth wore her best dress, carefully mended and pressed for the occasion, while Alexander had purchased a new shirt and taken extra care with his appearance. They stood before the preacher and spoke their vows with quiet sincerity, promising to honor and support each other through whatever challenges lay ahead. The kiss that sealed their union was brief and respectful, but Elizabeth felt something stir within her as Alexander's lips touched hers. It was not passion exactly, but a recognition of possibility, a sense that their partnership might evolve into something deeper and more meaningful than either had originally anticipated. The reception was modest, held in Carol Mitchell's parlor with a small group of well-wishers who had supported Elizabeth throughout her ordeal. Even Aaron Thomas seemed moved by the ceremony, raising his glass of cider in a toast that brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes. "To Alexander and Elizabeth," he said solemnly, "may your marriage be blessed with the same courage and determination you've both shown in fighting for what's right." Marshall Richardson attended the ceremony with obvious reluctance, his presence more official than celebratory. But even he seemed grudgingly impressed by the genuine affection and respect evident between the newlyweds. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Richardson nodded curtly and departed without further comment, his legal objections satisfied if not his personal reservations. The ride back to the mountain cabin that evening carried a different quality than their previous journeys together. They were no longer employer and employee, or even just friends and partners. They were husband and wife, bound by law and commitment to face whatever the future might bring. "How do you feel?" Alexander asked as they approached their home, the cabin windows glowing warmly in the gathering dusk. "Different," Elizabeth replied honestly. but not in a bad way, more settled perhaps, as if something that was uncertain has become certain. Alexander nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The marriage had resolved more than just their legal difficulties. It had provided a framework for their relationship that allowed both of them to invest more fully in their shared future without fear of sudden abandonment or change. That night, they sat on their porch as they had so many times before, but the conversation carried new undertones of intimacy and permanence. They were no longer two people temporarily sharing space and responsibilities. They were partners in the truest sense, committed to building something lasting together. "I never thought I'd marry again," Alexander admitted, as they watched the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. "After Sarah died, I assumed that part of my life was over." "I felt the same way after Joshua," Elizabeth replied. "I thought I would just exist, maybe survive, but never really live again." "And now?" Elizabeth considered the question, aware that her answer would reveal more about her feelings than she had previously been willing to acknowledge. "Now I think maybe we can both live again, just differently than we expected." The summer passed in a blur of shared work and growing intimacy. Marriage had indeed changed things between them, though not in the dramatic ways Elizabeth had feared. Instead, the changes were subtle but profound. Longer conversations, more comfortable silences, small gestures of affection and consideration that spoke of deepening connection. Alexander began including Elizabeth in decisions about the cabin and property that went beyond her role as housekeeper. They planned improvements together, discussed the best locations for expanding the garden, debated the merits of different crops and livestock. Elizabeth found herself thinking in terms of our home and our future rather than temporary employment. The physical aspect of their marriage evolved gradually, naturally, without pressure or expectation from either side. They shared the same house but maintained separate sleeping arrangements initially, allowing their emotional intimacy to develop at its own pace. When they finally came together as husband and wife in the fullest sense, it was with tenderness and mutual desire rather than obligation or desperation. "I love you," Elizabeth whispered one evening as they lay together in Alexander's bed, the confession emerging spontaneously from depths she had not known existed. "I love you too," Alexander replied, his voice filled with wonder at the truth of his own words. "I didn't expect it, but I do." The admission marked a turning point in their relationship, transforming what had begun as a practical arrangement into something approaching the ideal of marriage as a true partnership of hearts and minds. They were no longer just two wounded people finding comfort in companionship. They were husband and wife in every sense that mattered. But even as their personal happiness grew and flourished, external challenges continued to test their resolve. The harsh mountain winter that followed their wedding proved more severe than usual, with heavy snows that isolated them completely for weeks at a time. The supplies they had laid in were sufficient, but barely, and there were times when Elizabeth wondered if they would see spring. Alexander proved his worth as a mountain man during those difficult months, his skills and experience making the difference between survival and disaster. He hunted successfully even in the worst weather, maintained their fires and equipment, and kept their spirits up with stories and quiet companionship during the long, dark evenings. Elizabeth, for her part, demonstrated the resilience and resourcefulness that had carried her through earlier trials. She managed their food stores with careful efficiency, found ways to stretch supplies when game was scarce, and created a warm, comfortable home environment that made their isolation bearable rather than oppressive. Spring arrived late that year, but when it finally came, it brought with it a sense of renewal and possibility that seemed to infuse every aspect of their lives. Elizabeth emerged from the cabin on the first truly warm day of the season and felt as if she were seeing the mountain landscape with new eyes. The snow was melting in earnest, revealing patches of green grass and early wildflowers that spoke of life returning to the high country. "We made it," Alexander said, joining her on the porch with 2 cups of coffee steaming in the morning air. "We did," Elizabeth agreed, accepting her cup and settling beside him on the wooden bench he had built the previous summer. "And we're stronger for it." It was true, she realized. The winter that might have broken a less committed partnership had instead forged them into something more resilient and enduring. They had faced genuine hardship together and emerged not just intact, but more united than before. The arrival of Aaron Thomas in late April brought news from Pine Ridge that confirmed Elizabeth's sense of having made the right choice. The settlement had endured a difficult winter, with several families packing up and leaving for more hospitable locations. The Hendersons, who had been so eager to acquire Elizabeth's services, had abandoned their westward journey entirely and returned to relatives in the east. Mrs. Henderson took sick with pneumonia in January, Aaron reported, barely pulled through, and it left her too weak for travel. They decided frontier life wasn't for them after all. Elizabeth felt a mixture of sympathy and vindication at the news. She had been sold to the Hendersons like a piece of equipment, but the arrangement that had seemed so advantageous to them had ultimately proven to be built on unrealistic expectations and poor planning. "What about Marshall Richardson?" Alexander asked. "Is he still making trouble for people?" Aaron shook his head. "Transferred to another territory in February. Seems his superiors decided his approach was too heavy-handed for frontier communities. The new marshal is more interested in actual crimes than moral crusades." The news lifted a weight from Elizabeth's shoulders that she had not fully realized she was carrying. Richardson's departure meant that the threat of official interference in their marriage was essentially over, allowing them to focus on building their life together without looking over their shoulders for legal complications. As summer returned to the mountains, Elizabeth and Alexander began making plans that extended far beyond simple survival. They discussed expanding their property, perhaps acquiring additional land for grazing livestock. Alexander had been offered a contract to supply meat to the growing mining operations in the area, an opportunity that could provide steady income and a reason to develop their homestead more systematically. "We could build a real ranch here," Alexander said one evening as they walked the boundaries of their property. "Cattle, horses, maybe sheep. The grass is good and there's plenty of water." Elizabeth nodded, caught up in the vision he was painting. "And we could take in travelers, provide meals and lodging for people passing through. There's no decent stopping place between here and Pine Ridge." The plans they made that summer reflected their transformation from desperate survivors to confident partners building a future together. Elizabeth had traveled from being a commodity to be traded to being an equal partner in a growing enterprise. Alexander had evolved from a hermit, avoiding human contact, to a man ready to engage with the world on his own terms. Their first major test as business partners came in August, when a group of prospectors arrived at their door seeking food and shelter. The men were rough and tired, having spent weeks in the mountains searching for new mineral deposits. They had money to pay for what they needed, but they also brought with them the kind of crude behavior that had made Elizabeth wary of strangers. "We don't usually take in guests," Alexander told their leader, a grizzled man named Tom Bradley, who seemed to speak for the group. "We can pay," Bradley replied, producing a leather pouch heavy with coins. "And we're not looking for charity, just honest food and a place to sleep that doesn't involve sleeping on rocks." Elizabeth studied the men from the cabin doorway, weighing the potential benefits against the risks of opening their home to strangers. They seemed harmless enough, more tired than threatening, and the money they offered would be useful for their expansion plans. "One night," she said, stepping forward to join the conversation, "meals included, but you sleep in the barn, and there's no drinking or gambling on our property." Bradley looked surprised to hear a woman laying down terms, but he nodded agreement readily enough. "Fair terms, ma'am. We appreciate the hospitality." The evening that followed proved to be a revelation for both Elizabeth and Alexander. The prospectors were rough men, but they were also hungry for conversation and companionship after weeks of isolation. They shared stories of their adventures in the mountains, described the mining camps they had visited, and provided information about opportunities and challenges in the surrounding area. "You folks have got a good thing here," Bradley observed as they sat around the cabin's main room after dinner. "Beautiful location, good water, plenty of game. A man could do worse than settle in a place like this." "We think so," Alexander replied, his arm around Elizabeth's shoulders as they sat together on the small sofa. "We're planning to expand, maybe develop the place into a proper ranch and way station." "Smart thinking," Bradley said approvingly. "This area is going to see more traffic as the mining operations grow. People will need places to stop, resupply, rest their animals. You could do real well for yourselves." The prospectors departed the next morning with expressions of gratitude and promises to spread word about the Ross Ranch to other travelers. Elizabeth and Alexander watched them ride away with a sense of accomplishment and possibility. They had successfully hosted their first paying guests, and the experience had confirmed their belief that their location and skills could support a viable business. "How do you feel about last night?" Alexander asked as they cleaned up the breakfast dishes. "Good," Elizabeth replied without hesitation. "It felt right, having people here, providing something they needed, and they treated us both with respect, like partners." It was an important distinction, Elizabeth realized. The prospectors had dealt with both of them as equals, seeking Alexander's knowledge of the area while also acknowledging Elizabeth's authority in matters of hospitality and domestic arrangements. It was the kind of respect and recognition she had never received in Pine Ridge, where her value had been measured only in terms of her desperation and need. The success of their first venture into hospitality encouraged Alexander and Elizabeth to pursue their expansion plans more aggressively. By autumn, they had acquired a small herd of cattle from a rancher who was leaving the territory, built additional sleeping quarters for guests, and established relationships with suppliers in Pine Ridge who could provide goods they could not produce themselves. The transformation of their property was matched by the evolution of their marriage. What had begun as a practical arrangement to satisfy legal requirements had developed into a genuine partnership built on love, respect, and shared ambition. They worked together seamlessly, each contributing their strengths to their common enterprise while supporting each other through the inevitable challenges and setbacks. Elizabeth found herself thinking often of the wagon wheel that had precipitated their meeting, the simple piece of wood and iron that had represented the lowest point of her life. She had been valued at the price of a single wheel, deemed worth no more than a replaceable part in someone else's journey. Now she was a partner in a growing business, a wife cherished for her own worth, a woman who had rebuilt her life on her own terms. The irony was not lost on her that Alexander had ultimately given her not just a wagon wheel, but an entire wagon's worth of opportunities and possibilities. He had seen her value when others saw only burden, had offered her partnership when others offered only charity or exploitation. One evening in late October, as they sat by their fire planning for the winter ahead, Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The grief of losing Joshua would always be part of her, but it no longer defined her existence. She had learned that it was possible to honor the past while building toward the future, to carry love for the dead while opening her heart to new love among the living. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't intervened that day?" she asked Alexander. "If you had just let me go with the Hendersons?" Alexander considered the question seriously, as he did all her inquiries. "I think you would have survived," he said finally. "You're stronger than you knew then, and you would have found a way to build a life for yourself eventually. But I'm glad I didn't have to find out." "I'm glad too," Elizabeth said, moving closer to him on the sofa they now shared comfortably. "Not just because of what we have now, but because of what it taught me about my own worth. You saw something in me that I had forgotten was there." "I saw what was always there," Alexander corrected gently. "I just had the advantage of not being blinded by desperation or grief. Sometimes it takes an outsider to see clearly." As winter settled over the mountains once again, Elizabeth and Alexander faced the season with confidence and anticipation rather than mere endurance. They had proven to themselves and their community that their partnership was built on solid foundations, that their love was genuine, and their business prospects were sound. The cabin that had once sheltered a lonely hermit now rang with the sounds of a thriving household. Elizabeth's laughter mixed with Alexander's quiet humor, the scratch of pens as they planned and calculated, the comfortable sounds of two people who had found in each other not just companionship, but true partnership. On Christmas morning, as snow fell softly outside their windows and the fire crackled warmly in their hearth, Alexander presented Elizabeth with a gift that brought tears to her eyes. It was a small wooden sign carved with careful precision and painted in neat letters. "Ross Ranch, meals and lodging, all travelers welcome." "For the front gate," he explained, his eyes bright with love and pride, "to let everyone know that this is a place where people are valued for who they are, not just what they can pay." Elizabeth traced the letters with her finger, thinking of all the travelers who would see those words and know they would find fair treatment and honest hospitality at the Ross Ranch. It was a legacy worth building, a statement of values that honored both her journey from desperation to partnership and their shared commitment to treating others with the dignity she had been denied. "It's perfect," she said, rising to kiss her husband with all the love and gratitude in her heart. Just perfect. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the mountains in pristine white that would melt in spring to reveal new growth and new possibilities. Inside the cabin, Elizabeth and Alexander Ross sat together by their fire, planning for a future that stretched as far as their imaginations could reach, built on the solid foundation of love, respect, and the hard-won knowledge that every person deserves to be valued for who they are rather than what they can provide. The wagon wheel that had once represented Elizabeth's lowest value had been transformed into something infinitely more precious, the catalyst for a love story that proves sometimes the most unlikely partnerships can become the strongest foundations for building a life worth living.